The silence was the first weapon. Before the collapse of markets, before the sky over Ethel Prime wept blood-red tears that were not rain, there was the silence. It began in the deep space listening posts, arrays of crystalline sensors the size of asteroids, tuned to the faintest whispers of the void. For 3 standard cycles, the sector once designated Sol went quiet. Not the usual quiet of empty space, which hummed with the background radiation of creation, but a profound and absolute null. It was as if a patch of the universe had been scooped out, leaving a hole in reality itself. The Athelian Charter, the corporate political entity that had long since supplanted empires, paid it no mind. Earth was a dead asset, a planetary corpse strip-mined for its rare isotopes a century ago, its native species a footnote in their quarterly earnings reports, a cautionary tale for lesser worlds who resisted the lucrative embrace of commodification. Humanity had been loud, chaotic, and, ultimately, unprofitable. Their final broadcasts of protest and desperation had been archived and later sold on the black markets as experiential art for the Concordance elite. Their silence was logged as a final, insignificant system failure. It was the silence of a grave, and no one bothers to listen to the dead. But the dead were listening. Aboard the vessel Mnemosyne, a ship that moved through the folds of space-time like a bad memory, Kaylin felt the silence as a physical pressure against her temples. She was the conductor, the last pure-strain human in a place that was no longer a ship, but a mausoleum. Her world was the cool and sterile light of the command cradle, a throne of polished obsidian that contoured to her spine and fed whispers directly into her soul. The Mnemosyne didn't have a crew. It had a congregation, the ghosts of the Kepler 186F colony, the last bastion of free humanity, were encoded into the ship's quantum core. They were not AI. They were echoes. The final furious thoughts of 10 million people frozen at the moment of their annihilation by a charter-sanctioned asset denial weapon. Their rage was the ship's engine. Their sorrow was its navigation system. And their memory was its arsenal. Kaylin was the only living thing that could hear their symphony of pain and translate it into action. She had been born for this. A child of eugenics and desperation, raised in the lonely dark between stars. Her only lullabies, the dying screams of a world she had never known. Her first word had not been mother, but remember. She extended her consciousness, a fragile thread of warmth in the cold machine. The voices rose to meet her, a chorus of shattered lives. They sold our children's genes on the open market. Kaylin. They patented our DNA. The thought came from a biologist named Eris. They turned our poetry into advertising jingles. That was Alara, a teacher whose voice always sounded like wind through broken glass. And then there was the smallest voice, the one that served as her anchor in the storm of ghosts. They took my dog, whispered Leo, a boy of 9 who had died clutching a stuffed animal as his atmosphere burned away. They said he wasn't cost-effective. It was Leo's simple, pure grief that Kaylin could always hold on to, a single, perfect note of injustice that cut through the cacophony. "I know, Leo," she murmured, her physical voice a faint rasp in the sterile air of the cradle chamber. "Today, we make them remember him." Her fingers, pale and slender, danced over the console, which wasn't a screen, but a smooth, black surface that rippled like water at her touch. She wasn't inputting commands. She was shaping memories. The target was Xylos, the financial heart of the Athelian Charter. It was not a planet, but a web of orbital platforms, a city of light and data where quadrillions of credits were exchanged every second. Its defenses were formidable, designed to repel fleets and shatter asteroids, but they were not designed to guard against a memory. Kalen reached deep into the core, past the rage and the sorrow, and pulled forth a specific echo, the final hour of the New York Stock Exchange, a memory of pure, condensed panic, of numbers turning red, of fortunes evaporating, of the guttural screams of a species watching its entire concept of value dissolve into nothing. She took that memory, that sliver of human chaos, and focused it through the Mnemosynes reality imposition array. She aimed it at the heart of Xylos. She didn't fire a missile. She released an idea. On the gilded trading floors of Xylos, a Vexian broker screamed as the numbers on his data slate flickered and died, replaced by archaic symbols he couldn't comprehend. The entire network, the bedrock of charter wealth, began to hemorrhage data. But it wasn't just an erasure, it was a replacement. The complex algorithms of interstellar finance were overwritten by the primitive, brutal logic of Earth's final market crash. All value vanished. Digital vaults sealed themselves, their access codes replaced by the names of dead companies. Automated security systems began liquidating assets based on a century-old panic, selling off entire corporate holdings for the ghost of a dollar. Within minutes, the economy of the Athelian Charter was not just broken, it was insane, cannibalizing itself in a feedback loop of forgotten terror. There was no explosion, no alarm, just the silent, spreading paralysis of a system that had forgotten its own name. The Charter lost more wealth in 10 minutes than they had extracted from 100 conquered worlds. From the silent bridge of the Mnemosyne, Kalen felt the shockwave of their confusion, their dawning horror. It was a cold, satisfying balm on the screaming wounds in her mind, a small measure of payment for a toy dog. The retribution did not stop. 2 cycles later, on the resort world of Cygnus X1, a planet bioengineered into a paradise of earthly delights for the Charter's most decadent citizens, the second echo struck. The planet was famous for its menagerie of recreated Earth fauna, majestic creatures brought back through patented gene splicing, but made docile and compliant. Tourists paid fortunes to ride tame tyrannosaurs and watch herds of placid triceratops graze on alien plains. Kalen chose a different memory this time, not of finance, but of biology. She chose the memory of a prion disease, of mad cow, of nature's own horrifying rebellion against hubris. She broadcast the ghost of a misfolded protein. On the verdant fields of Cygnus X1, the gentle giants began to twitch, their eyes glazed over. The placid herbivores suddenly turned on their keepers, their horns no longer ornamental. The carnivores, bred for show, rediscovered a feral hunger that no gene splicing could truly erase. The resort world descended into a bloodbath, a screaming chaos of predator and prey, as every creature warped into a monstrous, agonizing parody of what it was supposed to be. The Charter's news channels called it a catastrophic ecological failure. But Kalen, and the ghosts who whispered to her, knew it was justice. Panic began to fester in the heart of the Concordance. 2 of the Charter's most valuable assets had been crippled by inexplicable, untraceable phenomena. There was no energy signature, no invading fleet, no declaration of war. It was as if the universe itself had developed a sudden, targeted grudge. The board of directors, a collection of beings from a dozen species whose forms ranged from crystalline entities to beings of pure gas held in containment suits, convened in their emergency sanctum. They were merchants and politicians, not warriors, and they were terrified. They brought in Inquisitor Zilar of the Groll, a species bred for logic and war, a being who had personally pacified the Orion Spur rebellions with brutal mathematical efficiency. Zylar was tall and slender, his chitinous exoskeleton the color of polished slate, his multifaceted eyes seeing the world not in images, but in patterns of pure data. He did not feel fear, only the frustrating presence of an equation without a solution. Zylar reviewed the data from Xylos and Cygnus X1. The official reports were useless, filled with superstition and panicked conjecture about rogue AIs or divine retribution. But Zylar saw the pattern. The economic collapse on Xylos hadn't been random. It mirrored, with perfect fidelity, a historical event from the extinct Terran civilization. The biological warp on Cygnus X1 used extinct Terran pathogens as its template. This was not a random plague. It was an attack. It was precise, symbolic, and deeply, deeply personal. It was, he concluded, an act of vengeance, but vengeance from whom the humans were gone, their homeworld a toxic grave, their final colony a wisp of radioactive gas. A dead species could not wage war, yet the data was irrefutable, tracing the faint, ghost-like ripples in space-time left by the attacks. His instruments led him not to a fleet or a planet, but back to that silent, gaping hole in the fabric of space. He pointed a long, three-jointed finger at the star chart. "The plague originates from here," he stated, his voice a series of resonant clicks and whistles translated into concordant standard by the device on his throat. "From the system you designated Sol." The board members shifted uncomfortably. "That's impossible, Inquisitor," hissed a gelatinous director. "Nothing has come from Sol in 100 years." Zylar turned his head slowly, his compound eyes capturing the director from 1,000 angles at once. "Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence," he clicked. "Something is in that grave. Something has learned to weaponize memory itself, and it is my task to dissect it." He ordered the assembly of the Third Inquisitorial Fleet, a collection of blade-like obsidian vessels designed not for brute force, but for surgical investigation and excision. Their primary weapons were not lasers, but reality anchors, designed to stabilize space-time and collapse quantum anomalies. He was going ghost hunting, and as his fleet prepared to cut a path toward the dead heart of the human empire, Kaelin felt his approach like a cold razor blade sliding across the edge of her awareness. The ghosts in her mind stirred, their whispers turning from sorrow to a low, hungry growl. Leo's voice was the clearest. "They're coming, Kaelin," he whispered, not with fear, but with a chilling, childish anticipation. Another one who wants to take things away. Kaelin closed her eyes, her hands resting on the cool, dark console of her cradle. The silence was over. It was time for the screaming to begin. Inquisitor Zylar's fleet did not storm the Sol system. It seeped into it, a droplet of black ink spreading through clear water. The Third Inquisitorial Fleet was a testament to Groll philosophy, elegant, silent, and lethal. Their blade ships, forged from carbon lattice armor that absorbed both light and sensor pings, moved without a ripple, their void displacement drives folding space in tiny, precise increments. They expected alarms, automated defenses, the lingering radiation of a forgotten war. They found only the profound, perfect null. The silence was deeper here, at its source. It was not an absence of sound, but an active, pressing presence that seemed to warp sensor readings and instill a disquieting sense of vertigo in the crew. Zilar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Abacus, his multifaceted eyes processing 1,000 streams of data. His logic dictated that this level of cosmic silence was a statistical impossibility. It was a manufactured state, a trap. "Activate the reality anchors," he commanded, his clicks resonating with calm authority. "Set them to a passive resonance. I want to see the shape of the cage before we rattle its bars." A low hum, felt more in the bones than heard with the ears, filled the fleet. Gigantic pylons extended from the hulls of the ships, projecting a stabilizing field, a mathematical assertion of baseline reality. They were reinforcing the laws of physics, daring whatever lurked in the void to break them. Aboard the Nemasan, Kalen felt the Groll fleet's arrival as a dull, irritating thrum at the edge of her senses. The reality anchors were like a cage of cold iron being lowered around her ghost choir. The whispers of the dead grew fainter, their edges blurred by the relentless hum of logic and order. "It's cold." Alara's voice shivered in her mind. "They're trying to make us forget we're here." Kalen's hands tightened on the cradle's console. Zilar was clever. He wasn't trying to fight the ghosts. He was trying to disprove them. He was treating them like a glitch in the universal code, a rounding error he could correct. "He thinks you are data," she whispered to the core. "He thinks memory is just a file to be deleted." A wave of indignant fury rose from the 10 million souls, a psychic roar that she struggled to contain. It was the ultimate insult. After being commodified, after being erased, now they were being dismissed as a phantom. Let's show him a memory he can't anchor. Kalen decided. She closed her eyes and reached for a different kind of echo, one that predated humanity's fall, one that was embedded not just in their minds, but in their very genes. The primal, irrational terror of a predator in the dark. The Groll were a species that had conquered their world by eradicating all illogical fear. They did not have a word for dread. They were about to learn its meaning. On the bridge of the Abacus, a junior officer flinched, his multifaceted eyes darting toward a shadow in the corner of his vision that wasn't there. Another crew member suddenly felt a spike of adrenaline, the ancient instinct to flee. But from what the instruments were clear, the ship was secure. Yet every member of the fleet was simultaneously gripped by the suffocating certainty that they were being watched, not by a ship, but by something inside their own hulls, a presence that had slipped past their shields and was now standing just behind them. They began to mistrust their own senses. The precise angles of the bridge seemed to shift and warp. The hum of the reality anchors sounded like a predator's growl. Zylar himself felt the alien sensation, a flicker in his cold logic he could only classify as systematic paranoia. He saw patterns of hostility in the star field, saw the faces of his own crew contort into threatening masks for a microsecond. This was not an energy weapon. It was an attack on the very concept of safety. It was weaponized doubt. "It is a mimetic virus," Zylar clicked, forcing the diagnosis through the rising tide of irrationality. "It targets the observer, not the observation. Reinforce cognitive firewalls. Purge all emotional resonance from the comms." He turned to a console, his 3 jointed fingers flying across its surface. He would not fight fear with courage. That was a human folly. He would fight it with its antithesis, absolute, unfeeling truth. He initiated the logic bomb. From the flagship, a pulse of pure data shot through the fleet and then outward, into the void. It wasn't a signal, it was a statement. 1 plus 1 factor 2. The speed of light is a constant. The past is immutable and can affect the present. It was a wave of mathematical and physical certainties, a brute force assertion of objective reality designed to overwhelm and nullify any subjective, emotional broadcast. For Kalen, the logic bomb was a wave of agony. It slammed into the Mnemosyne not as an explosion, but as a piercing, silent scream of negation. The ghosts in the core cried out as the wave of pure logic washed over them. It was like acid on a photograph, dissolving the edges of their identities. "We are not real," they wailed, their voices flickering. "We are just an echo." Eris, the biologist's memory of his family began to pixelate and fade. Alara, the teacher's poems, dissolved into meaningless static. The logic bomb was telling them they were dead and gone, and that their pain was nothing more than a residual data artifact. Worst of all, Leo's voice, her anchor, grew thin and reedy. "He's trying to take my dog again." Kalen. He whimpered, the memory of his pet becoming indistinct, its shape and name slipping away. "He's making me forget." Kalen screamed, a raw, human sound of fury and pain that echoed in the lonely cradle chamber. She wrapped her own consciousness around Leo's fading echo, shielding it, holding it together with sheer force of will. "No," she snarled, blood trickling from her nose. "You are real. Your pain is real. He will not erase you." But she knew she couldn't win this way. She couldn't fight a tidal wave of logic with whispers of grief. Zilar had found her weakness. He was fighting the memory, not the weapon. She needed a memory that wasn't just in the mind. She needed one that was in the very fabric of their reality. A memory so old and powerful that his anchors would shatter against it. She pushed her consciousness deeper into the ship than she ever had before, past the quantum foam of the ghost core, down into the bedrock of the Mnemosyne itself. The ship, her human ancestors had realized in their final, desperate days, needed a soul. But it also needed a body. And so they had given it one. They had not built the Mnemosyne from ore mined on some distant moon. They had built it from the one thing they had left. They had harvested the cold, dead crust of Earth itself. The ship's frame was woven from the continental plates. Its power conduits were lined with the planet's crystallized mantle. The Mnemosyne was not a ship carrying the ghosts of humanity. It was humanity's ghost, a vengeful Earth given consciousness and a way to move among the stars. Kalen reached for a memory that had no voice, no poetry, no grief. She reached for the memory of the planet's birth, the raw, geological memory of its formation, a time of fire and pressure, of a world tearing itself apart and stitching itself back together in a crucible of cosmic violence. She pulled on that memory, and the entire ship groaned, the metal of the cradle chamber glowing a dull, angry red. She was no longer just the conductor, she was the planet's nascent will. She was Pangea splitting apart. She was the asteroid that ended the dinosaurs. She was a billion years of tectonic fury condensed into a single moment. You want objective reality. Inquisitor. She spat through clenched teeth as the ghosts in the core, sensing this new power, rallied behind her. Here it is, outside, in the cold vacuum of space. The Mnemosyne finally appeared, not on sensors, But in reality, it shimmered into existence, a vast, jagged shape of blackened, scarred rock and glowing red fissures, looking less like a ship and more like a fragment of a shattered world. And from it, a wave of pure physical force erupted. It wasn't a laser or a missile. It was a gravimetric distortion, a memory of a planet's shifting mass. The reality anchors on the Groll fleet overloaded instantly, their pylons cracking and shattering as the very space around them bent and twisted. Ships were thrown into violent spins, alarms, silent for so long, now shrieked across every Groll bridge. Then came the thermal wave, the memory of a molten core, the blade ship's carbon lattice armor, designed to absorb energy, began to glow cherry red as it was superheated in an instant. Hulls buckled, systems failed. The precise, logical formation of the Third Inquisitorial Fleet dissolved into a chaotic mess of crippled vessels. On the bridge of the Abacus, which had borne the brunt of the assault, Xylar was thrown against a bulkhead. His chitinous exoskeleton was cracked, and one of his multifaceted eyes was shattered, leaking iridescent fluid. But the remaining eyes were fixed on the apparition hanging in space before him. The data streaming in was nonsensical. It was a ship, but it had the mass and geological composition of a terrestrial planet's crust. It emitted no energy. Yet it had just boiled his fleet. His logic had been met with a force that was both a memory and a physical law. It was an impossible fusion. He finally understood. He was not fighting a ghost in a machine. He was fighting a ghost that was the machine. A ghost that was, in fact, an entire world. Fall back. He clicked, his translated voice strained, a hint of something alien awe, perhaps coloring his tone. Regroup at the Ort cloud. Re-evaluate. He knew now that his scalpel was useless. He had come to dissect a phantom. He had found a god. As the surviving Groll ships limped away, Kaelin collapsed in her cradle, shaking and spent. The planetary memory receded, leaving her feeling hollowed out and fragile. The ghosts whispered their thanks, their voices clear and strong once more. But Kaelin knew this was not a final victory. It was a revelation. She had shown him what she was. She had shown him the ghost of Earth. And the Charter, once they learned of it, would not send another Inquisitor with a logic bomb. They would send an exorcist. They would send an army to kill a planet all over again. In the bruised twilight of the Oort cloud, amongst the frozen ghosts of comets, the Third Inquisitorial Fleet was a hospital for broken axioms. Inquisitor Xylar stood within a shimmering diagnostic cocoon aboard the Abacus, his cracked exoskeleton being meticulously sealed by nanoforges. His shattered eye had been replaced with a prosthetic that fed him raw, unfiltered data, a constant stream of stellar radiation and quantum noise that he found perversely calming. He was composing his report to the Ethelian Charter, not on a data slate, but by dictating it directly to the ship's logic core, his precise clicks forming sentences of irrefutable truth. The entity designated Minimosity is not a vessel in the conventional sense, he stated, the words appearing as flawless script in the air before him. It is a Class 7 geomorphic consciousness, a planetary fragment, reanimated and weaponized. Its offensive capabilities are not technological, but are manifestations of geological and biological memory. It does not fire weapons, it imposes historical states. To engage it with conventional force is akin to attempting to bombard a hurricane with pebbles. To engage it with logical force. He paused. The memory of the psychic assault, a cold spot in his processing, is to challenge an axiom of its existence, which it will defend with the full, physical weight of its being. He concluded his report with a stark recommendation. This is not an asset to be liquidated. It is a new form of life, a hostile one, born of our own historical negligence. It requires study, quarantine, and a new branch of science to even begin to comprehend. Any attempt at simple annihilation will be met with a response of an equal and opposite nature, the consequences of which are, by my logic, existentially catastrophic. He sent the report, knowing with cold certainty that the corporate minds of the charter would read his logic, understand his facts, and then proceed to do the exact opposite of what he advised. He was a scientist who had discovered fire, and he was reporting his findings to a board of pyromaniacs. The emergency session of the Athelian Charter Board was a symphony of avarice and fear. Zilar's report was projected in the center of their sanctum, his logical, dispassionate words a source of profound irritation. Geomorphic consciousness, scoffed Director Zorgon, a being of crystalline silicon whose thoughts manifested as chimes of light. He speaks poetry. This is a derelict asset, a haunted rock. It has damaged shareholder confidence. A corpulent gas being named Pleath floated agitatedly in his containment suit. Confidence is the least of it. Our financial network is still rebooting from its historical state, and the gene stock on Cygnus is a total write-off. We are bleeding credits. They saw the universe not as a place of wonder and terror, but as a balance sheet. The Mnemosyne was a red entry, a catastrophic liability, and their response was not to understand it, but to erase it. They dismissed Zylar's warning as the overcautious rambling of a specialist who had failed. They needed a generalist. They needed a demolitions expert. A name was whispered, a name spoken only when an investment had gone so sour that the only option left was to burn the entire market to the ground. Yorick the Void Brethren. Yorick was not a soldier. He was a harvester. His fleet, the Scrappers, did not conquer worlds. They consumed them. They were the ultimate mercenaries, a nomadic flotilla of factory ships and mobile refineries that descended on doomed planets, cracked them open like nuts, and rendered them down into slag and raw elements for a fee. Their flagship was a monstrosity of function over form named the Maw, a vessel that was less a ship and more a mobile, planet-cracking industrial complex. The charter's message to Jorik was simple. The Sol system contains a rogue mineral asset of significant mass. Liquidate it. Scrape it down to the last molecule. We will pay you its weight in refined iridium. While the galaxy's worst predator was being summoned, the Mnemosyne healed, drifting through the silent expanse of the Kuiper Belt. It was a wound in the darkness, but it was a living wound. Kaelin lay in the command cradle, her body in a deep, regenerative trance, but her mind was awake, adrift in the ship's consciousness. She felt the vessel's slow repair. It was not a process of welding metal and replacing circuits. The Mnemosyne drew to itself the debris of the outer system. Dust, ice, and stray asteroids were pulled into its low orbit, broken down by localized gravimetric fields, and integrated into its rocky hide. New veins of crystalline structures grew like nerves through its crust, patching the fissures left by her channeling of the planet's birth. It was a slow, organic process, like a body forming a scar. The ghosts were quiet, a low, constant hum of presence, their fury sated for the moment, their sorrow a soft, mournful song that lulled Kalen's healing mind. Leo's voice was a warm spot in the cold. "Are you sleeping?" he whispered. "Resting," she sent back. Her thought a faint ripple. "The ship is eating rocks," he observed with childish wonder. "It's remembering how to be whole," she explained. And in that moment, she felt a profound shift in her connection to the ship. Before, she had been its conductor, wielding its memories like an orchestra. Now, she felt as though she was part of its very substance. She could feel the slow grind of the rock integrating into the hull, the cold of a captured ice fragment, the faint radioactive signature of a rogue asteroid. Her consciousness was merging with the geological memory of Earth itself. She was no longer just the keeper of its pain. She was becoming the vessel of its existence. When she finally awoke, her eyes opening in the dim light of the cradle chamber, she felt a strength that was not her own. It was ancient, patient, and as solid as bedrock. And with it came a new sense of perception. She did not need sensors to know they were coming. She could feel it in the very fabric of space, a vibration of pure, brutal intent that was utterly alien. It was the feeling of a jackhammer approaching a tomb. The arrival of the Void Brethren was an act of cosmic vandalism. They did not fold space, they tore it. A ragged, shimmering wound opened near the orbit of Neptune, and the maw punched its way into reality, followed by its swarm of smaller scrapper ships. The maw was a nightmare of industrial design, a kilometers-long behemoth of rust-colored armor plating, exposed conduits belching plasma, and a vast, jaw-like structure at its prow that housed a terrifying array of drills, plasma cutters, and tractor beams. It was not built for war. It was built for deconstruction. Its scrapper escorts were no more elegant, resembling flying buzz saws and grappling claws. There was no silence with them, only the roar of brute force engines and the crackle of chaotic energy fields. A system-wide broadcast erupted from the maw. Not a diplomatic hail, but a bellow. Jorik's voice was a gravelly roar, synthesized and amplified into a sound that could crack asteroids. "Attention! Rogue asset! By the authority of the Athelian Charter, this system is now a designated reclamation zone. Your existence has been deemed economically non-viable. Power down and prepare to be rendered. This is your only notification." Kalen rose from her cradle. The ghosts in the core swirled around her consciousness, no longer just sorrowful or angry, but utterly, profoundly offended. They had been killed by corporate greed once. Now, that same greed had returned to desecrate their grave. "They think we are just rocks," Aris the biologist hissed in her mind. "They think we are ore to be mined." "Let's show them what kind of ore we are," Elara the teacher whispered, her voice like the sharpening of a blade. Leo was silent, but Kalen could feel his small, fierce resolve like a burning coal in her heart. This was not a battle of ideas or a contest of logic. This was pest control. The Void Brethren were cosmic termites, come to chew her world down to dust. Her hands drifted over the obsidian console, the surface rippling in anticipation. She felt the solid mass of the ship around her, the weight of a world, the patience of stone. The Void Brethren saw a rock. They had no idea that the rock was watching them back, with the memories of 10 million souls and the fury of a dead planet. She opened a channel, her own, pure voice cutting through the roar of Yorick's broadcast, a sliver of ice in a furnace. "We are the memory of Earth," she said, her words echoing from the mnemosyne itself, carried on a wave of focused gravity that made the hulls of the scrapper ships groan. "You have come to dig a grave. You will find you are already in it. The hunt was over. The war for the soul of the Sol system was about to begin." Yorick the Void Brethren laughed. It was a sound like grinding rocks, amplified 1,000 times by the Maw's broadcast system, a sonic battering ram of contempt that rolled across the void. "The rocks are talking. Boys," he roared to his fleet, "threats from a ghost on a pebble. We've cracked moons that sang prettier songs than that before we turn them into slag. Deploy the pulverizers. Let's get to work." The Void Brethren did not engage in tactics. They engaged in process. The swarm of scrapper ships broke formation and descended upon the mnemosyne like a plague of locusts. At their fore were the pulverizers, vessels designed for a single, brutal purpose to anchor themselves to a celestial body and hammer it apart with seismic charges and kinetic impactors. They were less ships and more flying geological hammers. They fired grappling hooks the size of HAB units, their barbed tips glowing with energy as they bit into the rocky hide of the mnemosyne, attempting to get a purchase on the shifting, scarred surface. They were trying to chain down a phantom. Kalen felt the impacts not as explosions, but as a series of jarring, profane intrusions, like nails being driven into the coffin of a loved one. The ghosts in the core screamed in outrage. This was not a battle. It was a desecration. "They are touching us." Ilara's voice was a razor's edge. "They are scarring our home." But Kalen was no longer just a conduit for their rage. Her fusion with the ship, with the planetary memory itself, had given her a deeper, colder fury, the fury of a mountain in the path of a glacier. "The Earth remembers pressure," she whispered, her hands moving across the console, not to fire a weapon, but to awaken a law of nature. She focused on the points where the pulverizer's grappling hooks had anchored. She did not try to shake them off. Instead, she introduced a memory of geological stress. She made the ship's crust remember what it was like to be a tectonic plate under 1 billion tons of pressure. The rock around the grappling hooks did not shatter. It flowed under an impossible, localized gravimetric shear. The ship's surface turned molten and then recrystallized in a microsecond, not just pushing the hooks out, but consuming them. The pulverizers found their unbreakable tethering cables suddenly fused into the very substance of their target. They were no longer anchored to the mnemosyne. They were part of it. Before their captains could even process the tactical nightmare of being permanently attached to their enemy, Kalen initiated the next phase. She released a memory of seismic rebound. The entire surface of the mnemosyne bucked, a single, violent planetary spasm. The captured pulverizers were whipped around like stones on a string, their hulls groaning and tearing apart under the impossible G-forces. They were slammed into their sister ships, into each other, creating a chaotic maelstrom of wreckage and exploding reactors. The Void Brethren's initial assault had been turned into a self-destructive demolition derby. Aboard the Maw, Jorik watched the unfolding chaos on his main view screen, his gravelly laughter dying in his throat. His amusement curdled into disbelief, then into a grudging, furious respect. "So the pebble bites back," he grunted. This was no simple mining operation. The asset was actively resisting, using its own mass as a weapon. This was going to be more interesting and more expensive than he had anticipated. "All ships, evasive maneuvers," he bellowed. "Launch the corers. Forget the surface. We'll crack it open from the inside out." The surviving scrappers scattered as a new wave of ships launched from the Maw's cavernous hangar. The corers were needle-like vessels, tipped with drills forged from collapsed matter alloys and armed with deep penetration melta-charges. Their mission was to bypass the hostile surface, drill directly into the heart of the Mnemosyne, and detonate its core, breaking it into manageable, profitable chunks. They streaked towards the ghost ship, their engines leaving trails of angry fire in the silent dark. Kaylin felt their approach as a series of sharp, painful needles aimed at her heart. They were not trying to scar her home anymore. They were trying to kill it. "They want the core," she murmured, feeling the quantum hum of the 10 million souls who resided there, the source of her power, the heart of her world. They will not have it. She could not use brute force against the corers. They were too fast, too small. She needed a different kind of memory, not one of fire or rock, but one of life. She reached deep into the Earth's biological history, to a time before humanity, before the dinosaurs, a time of primordial oceans and the first, desperate struggle for survival. She remembered the immune system. She remembered the body's relentless, microscopic war against invasion. The corers were a virus, and she would meet them with antibodies. As the needle ships began their drilling, their superheated tips biting into the planet ship's crust, the rock around them began to change. Crystalline structures, dormant within the Mnemosyne's composite hull, suddenly activated. They grew with unnatural speed, forming complex, interlocking lattices, moving with a strange, biological purpose. They were not just blocking the drills, they were actively attacking them. Crystalline shards, sharp as monomolecular blades, flaked off and swarmed the corers' engines. Other formations grew around the ships, constricting and crushing them like an python. One corer captain screamed over the comm as his ship was impaled by a crystal spire that grew through his cockpit in the blink of an eye. The Mnemosyne was fighting off the infection, its own body becoming a weapon. But the most terrifying defense was the one they couldn't see. Microscopic, crystalline spores were released from the drill sites, clinging to the hulls of the retreating corers. They were dormant, inert, a patient plague waiting for the right moment to awaken. Jork slammed a massive, gauntleted fist onto his command console, cracking its armored surface. He had lost a dozen more ships. This asset wasn't just hostile, it was intelligent, adaptive, and utterly alien in its methods. He was trying to demolish a fortress, and the fortress was growing fangs and claws. He had underestimated it. He had underestimated the sheer, stubborn will of a dead thing that refused to be buried. "Fine," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. He was done playing. The time for tools was over. It was time to use the maw itself. "Bring us in. Prepare the planet cracker. We're going to take a bite." The colossal ship began to move, its engines groaning as it oriented its massive, jaw-like prow towards the Mnemosyne. The twin arms of the planet cracker, two immense structures lined with city-sized plasma cutters and gravimetric crushers, began to power up, glowing with an energy that made the stars themselves seem to dim. York was going to do what he did best. He was going to devour a world. Kaylin felt the maw's approach as a shadow falling over her soul. This was the final threat. Not a hammer, not a needle, but an all-consuming void. The ship was an engine of absolute entropy, a machine designed to unmake creation itself. The ghosts in the core fell silent, their anger replaced by a cold, primal fear that resonated with Kalen's own. This was how their first home had died, not in a glorious battle, but in the cold, methodical calculus of resource extraction. Now, its final remnant, their collective tomb and Warship, faced the same fate. She looked at the image of the approaching maw, a vision of industrial hell, and she felt a flicker of despair. How could she fight a thing that was built to eat planets? Her memories were of life, of struggle, of a world that fought to exist. The maw was the opposite. It was a monument to non-existence. But then, Leo's voice, small and clear, cut through her fear. He's a bully. Kalen. The simple, childish observation was like a beam of light in the darkness. He wasn't a god. He wasn't an axiom of the universe. He was just a bully with a bigger hammer. And bullies. Leo knew, only understood one thing. She looked at the approaching jaws, and a new memory surfaced, not of Earth's life, but of its death. The memory of the asset denial weapon that had boiled the atmosphere of Kepler 186F. The memory of what the Charter had done to her people. It was a memory of pure, weaponized energy. A memory of a star brought to ground. She had been saving it. She had been afraid of it. Afraid that using it would make her no different from them. But she was not them. She was not doing this for profit. She was not doing this for conquest. She was doing it for a little boy who had lost his dog. "All right, Jorik," she whispered as she laid her hands on the console, a great and terrible calm settling over her. "You want to take a bite choke on it?" The fissures on the Nemasin began to glow, not with the dull red of a molten core, but with the incandescent, terrifying white of a star's heart. The space between the maw and the Nemazini ignited. It wasn't a beam or a projectile, but a fundamental shift in reality. Kalen had unleashed the memory of the Kepler 186F cataclysm, not as an explosion, but as a sustained, focused wave of pure solar fury. The void itself seemed to catch fire as the ghost of a dying star was born between the two vessels. Yorick, shielded on the bridge of the maw, watched in stunned disbelief as his forward sensors overloaded and melted. The incandescent energy was not just heat, it was a conceptual assault. It was the memory of a son's death throes, and it carried with it the agonizing echo of 10 million souls being vaporized. The psychic backlash slammed into the maw's bridge, a tidal wave of pain and terror. Jorik's mercenary crew, hardened veterans of 100 brutal reclamation projects, screamed and collapsed at their stations, clutching their heads, their minds flooded with a horror for which their brutal lives had no context. Jorik himself roared, staggering back from his console as the ghost of 1 billion burning souls tried to claw its way into his mind. He was a creature of matter and force. He had no defense against a weaponized atrocity, but the maw was built to withstand the death of planets, and its automated defenses kicked in. Its immense, jaw-like planet-cracker arms, glowing with their own terrible energy, slammed shut not on the Nemazin, but on the stellar apparition between them, attempting to crush the ghost of the star. It was an act of pure, mechanical arrogance. The result was a cataclysm. The collision of the planet cracker's gravimetric field with the solar memory wave created a space-time fracture. A wound in the universe opened, a swirling vortex of impossible colors and screaming physics. Jorik watched in horror as the forward third of his colossal ship, the entire planet cracker assembly, was not just destroyed, but erased, pulled into the rift and annihilated from existence. The Maw, a vessel that had consumed worlds, was now itself grievously wounded, its prow a ragged stump, vomiting plasma and atmosphere into the void. The rift, unstable and violent, began to collapse, but not before it spat out a final, shuddering wave of distorted reality that washed over both fleets. For the Mimazan, the wave was a convulsion. The ship, already straining under the effort of channeling a sun, was twisted and scarred. New canyons were carved across its surface, and the faint green of the nascent life support systems flickered and died. Kaylin was thrown from the command cradle, her body hitting the cold obsidian floor. The link was broken. The ghosts in the core, disoriented and terrified by the reality warp, scattered like dust in a hurricane, their voices a cacophony of confusion. For the Void Brethren, the effect was far worse. The dormant crystalline spores that had clung to their hulls, the microscopic antibodies Kaylin had released earlier, were activated by the reality wave. On the bridges and in the engine rooms of the surviving scrapper ships, the plague awakened. Crystalline growths erupted from consoles, from bulkheads, from the very bodies of the crew. Within minutes, Jorik's fleet was petrified, its ships becoming silent, lifeless monuments of crystal and steel, their crews frozen in their final moments of terror. The great predator of the void had been turned into a ghost fleet of statues. The Maw itself, crippled and bleeding, was a dying beast. Jorik, his mind reeling and his ship in ruins, had only one thought: survival. With its remaining engines, the great ship turned and began to limp away, tearing a ragged path back towards the wound in space from which it had come, seeking to escape the system that had broken it. He was a bully who had finally met something that wouldn't just fight back, but would make him share its pain. As his ship vanished, a profound silence, deeper than any that had come before, settled over the Sol system. The silence of exhaustion, the silence of survival. Kaylin pushed herself up, her body bruised, her mind feeling frayed and disconnected. The ghosts were still there, but they were faint, their whispers filled with weariness. She stumbled back to the cradle, her sanctuary, her throne, her prison. The ship was alive, but it was wounded, perhaps mortally. The rage that had fueled it, the pure, white-hot vengeance, had been spent in that final terrible act. What was left was a deep, aching grief, the sorrow of a world that had been forced to become a monster to save itself. She reached out with her mind, not to command, but to listen. She felt the ship's pain, the groaning of its rocky frame, the silence where the fledgling life had been. But beneath it all, she felt something else, a quiet, stubborn resilience. The memory of Earth was not just of fire and pressure and death. It was also the memory of recovery, of life clinging to volcanic vents in the deepest oceans, of forests regrowing after a fire, of a planet that refused, over and over again, to die. "It's not over," she whispered to the quiet ghosts. "We lived. That's the first victory." Leo's voice was the first answer, no longer a whisper of grief, but a soft, tired question. "Can my dog come back now?" Kaylin felt a tear trace a path through the grime on her cheek. It was the first tear she had shed since she was a child. "No, Leo," she thought back, her heart aching with a truth that was heavier than any planet. but we can build a world where no one ever takes another one away. In the years that followed, the legend of the Sol system grew throughout the shattered remnants of the Athelian Charter. They called it the Ghost Sector, the Grave Star, a place haunted by a world that killed. No one dared venture near it. The Charter itself, its economy broken, and its enforcers either dead or terrified, crumbled into warring factions. In the power vacuum, new alliances formed, built not on profit, but on a shared, quiet fear of what lay in the dark. The story of the Namazani became a cautionary tale, a myth whispered in a dozen languages about the cost of forgetting your dead. Back in the silent heart of it all, the work of remembrance began. The Namazan did not leave. It settled into a slow, patient orbit around the sun. Its ancient, scarred parent. It gathered the frozen water of the Oort cloud, pulling comets into its embrace, not to consume them, but to let them melt across its surface. In the deep canyons carved by Jorik's hubris, the first rivers of a new world began to flow. Kylan, no longer a conductor of vengeance but a gardener of memory, guided the process. She and the ghosts seeded the ship's surface with the archived DNA of Earth's life. Hardy mosses were the first to take root, then grasses, then the first saplings of trees that had not seen sunlight in centuries. The Mimazan was no longer a weapon. It was becoming a terrarium. It was becoming an ark. It was becoming Earth, reborn not on a planet, but on the very vessel of its own pain. Kaylin knew she would never set foot on a green field under a blue sky. Her body was bound to the cradle, her life entwined with the ship's. But as she watched the first fragile flower bloom in the dark soil of her world ship, watered by a melted comet and watched over by the quiet ghosts of the lost, she felt a sensation that was not vengeance, not sorrow, not even survival. It was peace, the final, most powerful memory of all.